The Peterson family appeared to have it all. William, a meticulous and hard-working software engineer, had built a stable life for his family, anchored by a comfortable home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. His wife, Diane, balanced her time between being a yoga instructor and the glue that held their household together. Their 15-year-old daughter, Ashley, was a bright, spirited girl whose debates around the dinner table brought a spark of energy to their otherwise predictable routine. Yet, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a pristine lake, small fractures were spreading through the foundation of their seemingly perfect lives. Lately, Ashley had become obsessed with questioning societal norms, particularly those about relationships. What had started as a school project evolved into a series of passionate dinner table debates. Monogamy is just a social construct, she argued one evening, her face lit with the fervor of youthful conviction. Imagine how much happier people could be if they were honest about their desires instead of pretending to conform. William, sipping his coffee, found her ideas amusing at first. Diane, too, seemed entertained, though she contributed little to the discussions. Occasionally, however, Diane's silence was broken by a quiet nod or a thoughtful hum, as though Ashley's words struck a chord deeper than mere curiosity. William dismissed it. Their daughter was bright, creative, and full of energy. It was natural for her to question the world. What he didn't realize was that Ashley's enthusiasm was planting seeds in Diane's mind. Months later, William noticed changes in Diane. She seemed distracted, distant, her routine subtly shifting in ways that unsettled him. Her yoga classes ran late more often than not, and her phone, once left casually on countertops, was now always face down or in her pocket. He tried not to let it bother him. They had been married for 16 years, after all. But an unease had begun to settle in his chest. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after Ashley had gone to bed, Diane brought up a topic that shattered the fragile equilibrium of their marriage. "Will," she started hesitantly, setting her teacup down on the table. Her tone was soft but determined. "I've been thinking about what Ashley said. About monogamy." William glanced up from his book, sensing the gravity in her voice. "I think there might be something to it," she continued. "Maybe we've confined ourselves to expectations that no longer fit who we are. What if we tried an open marriage?" For a moment, William thought he had misheard her. He stared at Diane, his mind reeling. "What are you saying?" he finally managed. "It's not about dissatisfaction," Diane explained quickly, her hands clasped tightly together. "It's about honesty, Will. Growth. Exploring possibilities together." "Together," he echoed, though the word felt like a cruel irony. She looked at him with pleading eyes, and despite every instinct screaming at him to say no, he found himself nodding. He didn't fully understand why, perhaps it was fear of losing her, or maybe a desire to seem progressive. Either way, he agreed. At first, their experiment was tentative. Diane approached it with an openness that both comforted and confused him. William tried to approach the situation rationally, keeping communication open and trusting in their shared history. But the decision gnawed at him, a quiet discontent building beneath the surface. That discontent turned to alarm on a night he would never forget. William returned home from work to find Diane entertaining two men in their living room. They were strangers to him, tall, imposing, and utterly at ease in his home. Diane introduced them with a forced cheerfulness. "Will, this is Marcus and Andre," she said, gesturing toward the men. "We met through a mutual friend." William's stomach churned. His throat tightened as he mumbled a polite greeting, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. He excused himself to the kitchen, his hands shaking as he gripped the counter. This wasn't what he had agreed to, not by a long shot. His unease transformed into a surge of panic and indignation. Without fully thinking, he reached for his phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, Diane was livid. "What were you thinking?" she demanded after Marcus and Andre had left. "This is exactly what we talked about." "No, it's not." William shouted back, his voice raw. "You brought strangers into our home, Diane. What about Ashley? What kind of example are you setting for her?" Their argument raged late into the night, leaving both emotionally drained and further apart than ever before. The fragile framework of their marriage had collapsed under the weight of Diane's choices and William's inability to accept them. The next morning, William made a decision. He filed for divorce, certain there was no salvaging what was left of their relationship. As he began sorting through paperwork, a troubling thought lingered in the back of his mind. If Diane had kept secrets about their marriage, could there be others? The idea festered until he ordered a DNA test for Ashley. When the results arrived, the truth was more devastating than he could have imagined. Ashley was not his biological daughter. William sat alone in the living room, the report clutched in his trembling hands. The words blurred as tears welled in his eyes. Memories of Ashley's childhood flooded his mind, her first steps, her laughter as he pushed her on the swings, the pride he'd felt at her achievements. Those moments felt stolen now, tainted by a betrayal he couldn't comprehend. The divorce proceedings were swift but bitter. Diane fought for half of everything he'd worked for, and in the end, she got it. William, left with little more than his car and savings, moved out of the house they had once called home. The life he had built was gone, replaced by an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. He thought he had reached the depths of despair, but life still had more to reveal. William's life had turned into a surreal nightmare. Days blurred into weeks as he adjusted to the hollow reality of his existence post-divorce. The house was gone, sold to cover legal fees. Diane had moved into a new home, the spoils of their former life divided between them. Ashley stayed with her, their relationship strained but intact despite the revelations. For William, every memory of his daughter now carried an unbearable weight. It wasn't her fault, he knew that. Ashley had no say in the choices that brought her into the world. Yet every time he looked at her, he saw Diane's betrayal reflected back at him, an unspoken accusation of the years he'd unknowingly lived a lie. One morning, while sipping coffee in his sparsely furnished apartment, William stared at the DNA report sitting on the small table before him. He'd kept it, unable to throw away the damning piece of paper that had upended his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed answers, closure that the document alone couldn't provide. He decided to confront Diane one last time. When he arrived at Diane's new home, the sight of it made his stomach churn. It was eerily similar to their old house, comfortable, suburban, perfect on the outside. He rang the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding as footsteps approached. Diane opened the door, her expression immediately darkening when she saw him. "What are you doing here, Will?" she asked, folding her arms. "I need to talk to you," he said. "It won't take long." She hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. The living room was pristine, filled with familiar furniture he had once picked out. It felt like a mockery of the life they'd shared. "What do you want?" Diane's tone was clipped as she sat down, motioning for him to do the same. "I need to know who Ashley's father is," William said, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside him. Diane's face froze, her carefully maintained composure cracking for a moment. "That's none of your business," she said flatly. "It is my business," William shot back. "I raised her. I deserve to know the truth." "She's your daughter in every way that matters," Diane replied, her tone softening slightly. "Why can't you leave it at that?" "Because it matters to me," William said, his voice rising. "You lied to me for years. The least you can do is give me the truth now." Diane looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a nearby clock. Finally, she sighed. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a one-time thing. His name was Kevin. He was someone I met during a rough patch in our marriage." "Kevin who?" William demanded. "I don't know," Diane said, her eyes flashing with frustration. "I don't even remember his last name. It was years ago, Will. Let it go." But William couldn't let it go. Her vague answers only fueled his determination. He left the house feeling more unsettled than before. The name, Kevin, became a fixation, a key to unlocking the truth that still eluded him. Over the next few weeks, William's obsession deepened. He began combing through old photographs and social media posts, looking for any clue about Diane's past. He even reached out to mutual friends, subtly probing for information. Most had little to offer, but one conversation yielded a lead. Kevin. I think Diane mentioned someone by that name years ago, her old friend Susan said hesitantly. He was a guy she met at some yoga retreat. That's all I know. A yoga retreat. The detail felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Diane had attended several retreats early in their marriage, during a time when their relationship had been strained by William's long hours at work. He had encouraged her to go, thinking it would help her find balance. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Using the retreat's name, William tracked down a list of attendees from the year Diane had gone. It wasn't easy, most records were private, but his persistence paid off. One name stood out, Kevin Murdoch. With shaking hands, William searched for Kevin online. What he found made his breath catch. Kevin was a prominent entrepreneur, a charismatic figure who had built a wellness empire. His photos showed a man with piercing blue eyes and an easy smile, features William recognized in Ashley. The discovery was like a punch to the gut, but it also gave him a strange sense of clarity. He had found the truth he sought. Now, the question was what to do with it. William didn't have to wait long for the answer. Days later, a letter arrived from Diane's lawyer. She was requesting additional financial support for Ashley, citing the emotional toll the divorce had taken on their daughter. The audacity of it left William seething. He had already given up half of everything, including the home he had worked so hard to provide. But he wasn't the same man he'd been months ago. The betrayal and loss had hardened him, sharpened his resolve. If Diane wanted more, she'd have to fight for it, and this time, he wouldn't go down without a battle. As William sat in his dimly lit apartment that night, the weight of the past months bore down on him. The man he had been, the devoted husband, the trusting father, was gone. In his place was someone he barely recognized, someone driven by a need for justice, or maybe vengeance. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was clear, he was just getting started. The weeks that followed marked a transformation in William. The man who had once prided himself on his even temper and rational mind had been replaced by someone colder, sharper, and unyielding. Every interaction with Diane and Ashley now felt like a battlefield, every glance a potential clue. The truth he'd uncovered about Ashley's paternity had stripped away the last vestiges of trust and turned his world into a relentless search for answers. Diane's demand for additional financial support stung like a slap to the face. Sitting at his kitchen table, he reread the letter from her lawyer, his frustration bubbling into anger. She had already taken half of what he'd earned, his savings, investments, and the house. Now she wanted more. Worse, she dared to frame it as being for Ashley's benefit, leveraging the daughter he still loved against him. But William was no longer the man who would roll over to avoid conflict. He was determined to fight back. The first step was to gather every piece of leverage he could. He started by requesting detailed financial records from his lawyer, documents that outlined where the money Diane had received in the divorce had gone. As the statements trickled in, William found what he'd suspected all along, large, unexplained transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. Diane had been hiding something, and whatever it was, it would be her undoing. Late one evening, William stared at the numbers on his computer screen, connecting dots he hadn't noticed before. Several of the transfers corresponded with the time Ashley had started attending private soccer clinics. He'd assumed it was a splurge for their daughter's budding athletic talents, but now he wasn't so sure. The amounts were too high, too frequent. Frustrated and needing answers, William did something he never thought he'd do. He hired a private investigator. The man came highly recommended, discreet, thorough, and with a reputation for uncovering even the most well-hidden secrets. William provided every detail he could, Diane's erratic behavior, the mysterious financial transactions, and the information about Kevin Murdoch. "You want me to look into her?" the investigator asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Yes," William said firmly. "Her, and him. I want to know everything." As days turned into weeks, the investigator's updates came in sporadically but with increasing intrigue. Kevin Murdoch, as it turned out, wasn't just a yoga entrepreneur. He had a history of using his retreats as more than just wellness getaways. Several attendees had reported him for inappropriate relationships, though none had gone public with their accusations. His wealth and influence had buried every attempt to expose him. The most shocking discovery, however, came when the investigator delved into Diane's finances further. One of the accounts she had been transferring money to wasn't hers, it was tied to Kevin. The paper trail was clear, Diane had been funneling money to him for years, likely as part of some private arrangement. William's hands shook as he reviewed the report. The betrayal went deeper than he'd ever imagined. Diane hadn't just lied about Ashley's paternity, she had maintained a connection to Kevin all along, using funds that William had earned to support him. Fueled by this revelation, William reached out to his lawyer with a renewed sense of purpose. He had the evidence he needed to challenge Diane's claims, to show the court that she had been deceitful and manipulative. But beyond the legal battle, William began to plan something more personal. Diane and Kevin had spent years orchestrating this web of lies, and William was determined to make them face the consequences. One evening, as he sat in his apartment with the investigator's report spread across the table, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Ashley. "Dad, can we talk? I miss you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, she was still his daughter in the ways that mattered. He responded immediately, arranging to meet her at a nearby park the next afternoon. When they met, Ashley's face lit up with a hesitant smile, but William could see the tension in her posture. They sat on a bench overlooking the playground, the chatter of children filling the silence between them. "I'm sorry," Ashley said finally, her voice trembling. "For everything. I didn't know. I didn't understand how much this would hurt you." "It's not your fault," William replied, his voice softening. "None of this is your fault." "But I feel like it is," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom told me everything. About Kevin. About you finding out. I didn't know what to say." William took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What do you think about all this?" he asked gently. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's weird. I always thought you were my dad, and now," she looked away, her voice breaking. "I feel like I don't know who I am." "You're still you," William said, his heart aching as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No matter what the DNA says, you're my daughter, Ashley. I'll always be here for you." Her tears spilled over, and she leaned into him, the barriers between them crumbling. For the first time in weeks, William felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tempered by resolve. His relationship with Ashley was worth fighting for, but so was the truth. Diane and Kevin had taken enough from him. It was time to take something back. As Ashley left to return home, William sat in his car, his mind racing. He had a plan, and now, with both the evidence in hand and a renewed sense of purpose, he was ready to see it through. The storm was far from over, but William was no longer the man weathering it. He was the one who would command it. As the wheels of William's plan began turning, his focus shifted from merely surviving the betrayal to actively dismantling the fragile web of lies Diane and Kevin had spun. The investigators' findings had laid a foundation, but William knew he needed to wield the truth like a weapon, striking decisively and with precision. The time for passivity had passed. One rainy evening, sitting in his dim apartment, he reviewed the files on Diane's financial transfers and Kevin's dubious retreat practices. Each piece of evidence seemed heavier than the last, a grim testament to just how deep their deception had run. But this wasn't just about uncovering their betrayal anymore, it was about ensuring they could never hurt him or Ashley again. First, William revisited his lawyer, bringing the new evidence against Diane. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Meredith who had little patience for theatrics, immediately grasped the significance of the files. "This is damning," Meredith said, her tone matter-of-fact as she flipped through the documents. "You've got a strong case for reducing her claims, especially with this paper trail leading to Kevin. What are my chances of winning?" William asked. Meredith looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Better than before, but this is still family court. Judges don't like to upend the status quo unless there's a compelling reason. The fact that Ashley isn't biologically yours complicates things emotionally, but legally, it could help. If you push this angle, you could argue for revisiting custody or support." "Do it," Williams said without hesitation. "Push every angle. I'm not letting her bleed me dry any longer." Meredith nodded, but her expression carried a note of caution. "This could get ugly. Diane might try to spin this as a vendetta. Are you prepared for that?" William thought of Ashley, of the years he had spent building a life that had been hollowed out from the inside. "I'm prepared," he said. "Do whatever it takes." While the legal battle began to take shape, William set his sights on Kevin Murdoch. The man had walked away unscathed for too long, hiding behind his wealth and charisma. William couldn't confront Kevin directly, at least, not yet, but he could disrupt the carefully curated empire Kevin had built. William delved into Kevin's retreats, contacting past attendees under the guise of conducting a survey for a book on wellness. The stories he collected painted a damning picture: inappropriate advances, blurred boundaries, and whispered accusations of misconduct. Most participants were too intimidated to come forward publicly, but one woman, a former retreat employee, was willing to talk. Her name was Claire, and she agreed to meet William at a coffee shop downtown. When she arrived, she was visibly nervous, glancing around as though expecting someone to follow her. "I don't usually talk about this," she began, stirring her tea with trembling hands. "But I can't keep pretending it didn't happen." Claire recounted how Kevin had manipulated employees and guests alike, using his charm to disarm and control them. She had left after witnessing several instances of him crossing professional lines, including with Diane. "Your wife wasn't the only one," Claire said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He has a type, vulnerable, looking for validation. He makes them feel special, like they're the only one who sees the real him. It's disgusting." "Did you ever report him?" William asked. "Twice," Claire said. "Both times, the complaints disappeared. He has powerful friends, and most people are too scared to fight him." William's jaw tightened. "I'm not scared," he said. "If you're willing to share your story, I'll make sure it doesn't get buried." Claire hesitated but finally nodded. "I'll help, but be careful. Kevin doesn't just destroy reputations, he destroys people." Armed with Claire's testimony and the financial evidence tying Diane to Kevin, William began to put pressure on both of them. He sent anonymous tips to investigative journalists about Kevin's retreats, framing the story as a deep dive into the dark side of the wellness industry. He leaked details of Diane's transfers to Kevin to financial oversight boards, suggesting potential fraud. It didn't take long for the first cracks to appear. A prominent wellness blog published an exposé on Kevin, citing anonymous sources who described his manipulative practices and questionable ethics. Social media picked up the story, and the hashtag #MurdochExposed began trending. Kevin issued a dismissive statement, but the damage was done. Former attendees began coming forward, emboldened by the coverage. Meanwhile, Diane's lawyer contacted William's legal team, demanding an explanation for the malicious leaks. Meredith's response was swift and uncompromising, emphasizing that every detail William had revealed was backed by irrefutable evidence. The tension between William and Diane reached a boiling point when she called him directly, her voice shaking with rage. "Is this your idea of revenge?" she spat. "Dragging us through the mud? Hurting Ashley?" "I'm protecting her," William replied coldly. "From you. From Kevin. From every lie you told. You're ruining everything." Diane screamed. "Do you even care about what this is doing to her?" "Don't you dare talk to me about damage," William said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You did this. Not me." The call ended abruptly, but William felt no satisfaction. The fight was far from over. As the weeks wore on, the fallout from William's actions began to ripple outward. Kevin's retreats were cancelled, sponsors pulled their funding, and his reputation unraveled in real time. Diane found herself increasingly isolated, her demands for additional support undermined by her connection to Kevin's scandals. But amid the chaos, one moment stood out: a letter from Ashley. She'd written it by hand, a rarity in the age of text messages and emails. William opened it with trembling fingers, unsure of what to expect. "Dad. I know things are hard right now. I don't know what to say to make it better, but I want you to know I'm proud of you. You've always been there for me, even when it wasn't easy. I hope I can be there for you, too. Love. Ashley." The words hit him harder than any legal victory or exposé. In that moment, he realized that no matter how broken his family had become, his bond with Ashley was unshakable. William folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer with the few keepsakes he had left from his old life. He had lost so much, but he still had Ashley, and that was enough to keep fighting. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. Diane sat across from William, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. The weeks of hearings had taken their toll on both of them, but William remained stoic, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench. He'd fought for this moment, not out of vengeance, but for closure. The judge's voice broke the silence, each word landing like a hammer. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the financial mismanagement and ethical breaches demonstrated by Ms. Peterson warrant a revision of the original settlement. Custody arrangements will remain joint, but all additional financial support claims are denied. Furthermore, restitution for misallocated funds will be addressed in a separate hearing. Diane's face paled. For the first time, the consequences of her actions seemed to truly hit her. She glanced at William, her eyes pleading, but he offered no solace. The years of betrayal, lies, and manipulation had burned away any trace of the man who once would have forgiven her. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast, a faint drizzle painting the world in muted grays. William stepped onto the sidewalk, his lawyer congratulating him quietly before departing. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the rain wash over him. The battle was over, but the scars remained. "Dad." He turned to see Ashley standing nearby, her hands shoved into her coat pockets. She looked nervous, but her eyes held the same determination he'd always admired in her. Without a word, she walked up and hugged him tightly. William froze for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." "You have nothing to be sorry for," William said, his voice breaking. "You're my daughter, Ashley. Nothing changes that." As they pulled apart, Ashley smiled, tentative, but genuine. It was a glimmer of hope in the wreckage, a reminder of what still mattered. Together, they began walking toward his car, leaving the courthouse and its ghosts behind. In the distance, thunder rumbled, and William glanced up at the sky. The storm was over, but its echoes lingered. He wasn't the same man who had entered this fight, and the life he'd built would never be the same. But as he looked at Ashley, he realized he didn't have to be defined by the past. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like his own. And that, he decided, was enough. What would you do if your entire life unraveled in an instant? Share your thoughts on William's journey, his choices, and the shocking twists.